A judge has just handed down the sentence for Boston gangster James Whitey Bulger. The 84-year-old was convicted of a long list of charges that stem from the 1970s and 80s. They include murder and extortion, money laundering. Lindsay Duncombe is tracking the story. She joins me live from Washington. Prison time. What's Bulger facing, Lindsay?
Well, we knew at 84 years old that it was likely that Whitey Bulger would spend the rest of his life in prison. But what the judge did in this case was do exactly what prosecutors asked her to do, and that was to impose 2 consecutive life sentences plus an additional 5 years. So no question, Whitey Bulger will be spending the rest of his life in prison. This goes to all of the more than 30 charges he was convicted on, including involvement in 11 murders. Whitey Bulger essentially ran a huge crime ring in South Boston in the 70s and 80s. And what's interesting about him, too, is that he wasn't just doing the crime thing. He was also playing both sides of it in the sense that he was an FBI informant at the same time. So this really brings to the conclusion the trial that was going on for months, and particularly fascinating because Whitey Bulger left Boston in the 90s, took off, no one could find him. He was hanging out in Santa Monica, and he was just arrested a couple years ago. So now we know that this man won't be going back to Santa Monica. He will be in jail for the rest of his life.
And yesterday, the court heard some emotional statements, Lindsay. What was said?
Well, these were victims, people whose parents, whose mother or father or son were all killed or affected somehow by the crimes of Whitey Bulger. And they had been, many of them, watching this trial go on for months. This was their chance to, face him and talk to him. They did not mince words. He was called Satan. He was called a rat. He was called a coward as people stood in the courtroom and talked about how these crimes impacted their lives even really decades later. Throughout all of this, Whitey Bulger, who believes the whole process is a sham, he thinks he should have immunity, he doesn't really talk at all, he looks down at papers, didn't even acknowledge the fact that they were there. Take a listen to one of those victims. This is a man whose father was shot outside a country club more than 3 decades ago. Here's what he had to say outside the courtroom.
Well, he's not a very brave man. He won't even look at you. It's the statement I said in there fits. He's a coward. And it did feel good to describe him for what he is, a bag of jailhouse rags waiting to be placed on cold steel. And I hope he enjoys every day of his retirement there.
Now, if this sounds like it is fodder for Hollywood, well, Hollywood thought the same thing, too. In fact, Whitey Bulger's life was used as a basis for the Jack Nicholson character in the movie The Departed, because it just is such a really horrible, tragic, and interesting story, one that has now reached its conclusion.